when Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about the retained EU law bill, he sort of, suggests that we can use it to get rid of regulations on things like lemon growing because nobody in the UK grows lemons and stuff, which is just a bit of decluttering that doesn't do anything much for reducing business costs or whatever until we grow lemons here. I just wondered whether there was a presumption that almost everything gets assimilated, or basically huge amounts of the statute book is going to disappear because it's retained EU law and we don't really want it and stuff like that. Do we have any feel for where we might end up with? Plus whatever else you wanted to say.
Thanks, Jill. Well, what I was going to say was that the bill does two things. And the one we're talking about primarily, of course, is the big obvious one about sunsetting the content of retained EU law and thereby forcing Whitehall departments to review their retained EU law. And no, there is no assumption that everything will be rolled over. There are commitments that have been given for upholding of standards and protections, but there is an awful lot of legislative cruft and requirements to report to Brussels about schemes that we're no longer members of that can be safely disposed of, and departments are working through all that. But the other thing the bill does, which is much less talked about, but Joel mentioned it when he talked about the term assimilated law, is that it gets rid of legal concepts which are foreign to the UK statute book. So we call them interpretive effects collectively, but they are the concept of the supremacy of EU law, the general principles of interpretation of EU law, and the directly effective rights. And the fact that those sunset on the 31st of December in the bill means that even if departments want to keep the actual rules as they are, and there's no shame in that because the UK was a highly influential member of the European Union and it had a lot of say in what the rules were, and many of the rules are already optimized for the UK, and the bill provides powers for us to change those that aren't, but it allows us to keep through the preservation power to assimilate the ones that we want to keep, but shorn of those interpretive effects, and therefore making them sort of proper UK laws, if you like to look at it from that way.
Okay, now we could talk about the retained EU law bill for about 15 hours, but I want to move on, she said. Chris, a question back to you from John Peet from The Economist. Does the Windsor Framework not act as a huge constraint on future regulatory divergence to avoid a constantly thickening Irish seaboard? I'm going to slightly reinterpret John and say, do you think the Windsor Framework means that there's more of a constraint than there was as in the Boris Johnson, David Frost protocol, or a bit less of a constraint? Private confession, this is something that we're debating among think tanks here. So.
Well, I can't claim to be an expert, but the reason that we have the mechanisms for the UK internal market, including the Windsor Framework, are not to prevent divergence. Ministers fully recognise that the devolution settlements allow different nations of the UK to regulate different things in different ways. The existence of the UK mechanisms is to make sure that those things work properly, and that when devolved administrations want to do something differently to Westminster, that it can be managed with minimum disruption. I think it's too early to tell whether the Windsor Framework will sort of increase aversion to divergence or not. It could be interpreted as precisely a more streamlined mechanism for making these things work.